Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's going to be my first look for week 13 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And I usually save this for the end of the video, but since the beginning of the month, I thought I would say it now because it is the best time to sign up the way the Patreon billing cycle works, because they will charge you on the first of the month. So if you want to support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. It's only $10 a month, but you get access into the entire NFL DFS data sheet that I build each and every single week. I always get comments asking me where I get these spreadsheets, but I build them myself. So if you want access to it, that's where you get it. It's got pretty much all the information you want heading into the weekend, all the statistics. You guys watch the videos every single week. That's what you get access to, but you get the entire player pool instead of just a few guys that I pick and choose each and every single video. It's got cheat sheet with notes, projections. You can hop into my Discord chat and bug me all day if you want as well. So if you're interested, like I said, link is down below for that, but there's no pressure at all, only if you're interested. So without further ado, shameless plug out of the way, let's get into it. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. And as of right now, my favorite spend-up quarterback is Aaron Rodgers at $6,800. I don't think we absolutely have to play these guys like Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, and Deshaun Watson this week. I don't think they're absolute must-plays. So if we can save a little bit of money and go with guys in the mid-range and the cheap quarterbacks to be able to fit in guys like Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry just a little bit easier, I feel like that might be the way to go this week. As of right now, it's only Tuesday, so things can change when we get to the final thoughts video on Friday. But as of right now, this is my lean. So we'll start with Aaron Rodgers, $6,800, and a decent matchup versus Philly. I know Russell Wilson didn't exactly go off last night versus them, but this is still not the greatest defense in the world. Now, I know if you're looking at the numbers, they're only giving up the 10th fewest points per game and 230 passing yards and less than 1.5 passing touchdowns per game. So you're probably thinking, oh, they're pretty good versus quarterbacks, which they have been this season. But you got to keep in mind, they do play in the NFC East, so this is not the greatest defense in the world. They play some pretty bad quarterbacks like Daniel Jones. They played Dwayne Haskins in week 1. They play the Cowboys' backup quarterback. They played some other weak quarterbacks this season as well. So I think those numbers are a bit skewed. So I'm not really too concerned here for Aaron Rodgers. This is a good offense. They've been putting up a ton of points all season long, and they're still 20th DVA versus the pass. So that is still bottom half in the league. And Rodgers this season has been great, about 300 passing yards per game, 3 passing touchdowns, 35 pass attempts, and over 8 yards per attempt. Now, he doesn't offer us the rushing upside of guys like Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson, Josh Allen, but he's been really good through the air, and overall he's been very consistent this season. And I guess the only concern here is that they are 9-point favorites at home, so maybe this game gets out of hand where they're not really throwing the ball in the second half too much or the fourth quarter. And we've seen Carson Wentz have an awful season so far, so it would not be surprising if he got a turnover or two and the Packers just, I don't know, this game's not really that competitive, so that could hurt Aaron Rodgers' upside if they're just using Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams to grind out the clock at the end of the game. But overall, I think he's a solid play, but probably a better tournament play than cash game play this week. Then dropping down to the mid-range, we have Kirk Cousins at $6,400 in a fantastic matchup versus Jacksonville. He had a great game last week without Adam Thielen, so that was also pretty impressive. Had the game-winning touchdown drive with, a minute left versus the Carolina Panthers. Kind of got lucky with the Panthers missing the field goal, but it's still an excellent game from Kirk Cousins. It's just I'm not really sure we can expect that again. Now, he's going to have Adam Thielen back more than likely this week, so that's obviously a boost to the offense. But you got to keep in mind, they fumbled like 2 plays in a row, and it both turned into touchdowns, so the game script just got completely flipped for the Minnesota Vikings. I was expecting them to be winning in that game and kind of just run the ball with Dalvin Cook for the most part because it was a great matchup on the ground. Unfortunately for us Dalvin Cook owners, it probably wouldn't have mattered in cash games because of how high owned he was, but it certainly hurt in tournaments. But they really couldn't get the run going. Then Dalvin Cook got hurt at one point, so it kind of just changed the game there. But assuming that doesn't happen once again, I would expect this to be more of a Dalvin Cook game than a Kirk Cousins game, but this is a fantastic matchup versus Jacksonville. I think pretty much the entire offense can have a great game here. It's a 52-point over-under, which is one of the highest on the slate, and they have a team total of 30.75 this week. That's really good. I definitely want pieces of this offense because this is a fun offense. So you got Kirk Cousins, who's not been that bad, Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson, 2 excellent wide receivers, and then you have one of the best running backs in football in Dalvin Cook. So this is an offense that can put up a lot of points, and we know the Jacksonville defense is not that good at all. They're not very good versus the pass or versus the run. This season versus quarterbacks, they're allowing the 3rd most points per game. They're ranked 30th and 24.1 points, close to 300 passing yards and over 2 passing touchdowns, and they're 31st DVA versus the pass. This is an excellent spot for Kirk Cousins. $6,400 probably feels like the right price tag for him because this is a run-first team, but I mean, he should be able to throw a couple of touchdowns. And he's got 2 excellent wide receivers, and Dalvin Cook's a threat out of the backfield as well. So Cousins, definitely like the spot. I would say his upside maybe is a little bit limited unless this game turns into some turnovers for Minnesota and they find themselves trailing again, but I don't really see that being the case here with them being 9.5-point favorites. But overall, he should have a pretty solid game. Then Ryan Tannehill, $6,200. He's kind of similar to Kirk Cousins, where this is a team that likes to run the football, but he's still capable of putting up some pretty good games, and he's got good weapons to get the ball to as well, like A.J. Brown and Corey Davis. And I know we didn't get credit for the passing touchdown, but he did throw a swing pass to Derrick Henry, if that's what you would call it. Unfortunately, it was a little bit backwards, so they didn't count as a passing touchdown for Ryan Tannehill. But this is a good offense, an efficient offense, and I definitely want pieces to this game because we have a 54-point over-under, which is the highest on the slate as of right now, and the Titans have a team total of nearly 30, and it's only a 5.5-point spread, so this should be pretty back and forth for the most part. Now, I'd rather play the run game here with Derrick Henry. On the other side, I'd rather play Nick Chubb as well from the passing game. But both quarterbacks, I think, can be viable. Baker Mayfield is absolutely dirt cheap, but that's definitely a run-first team, and he's not really been putting up many big fantasy games this season outside of that Cincinnati game. But Tannehill is $6,200. He definitely has upside here. It gives you a little bit of rushing upside as well. He's certainly not Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, those kind of guys, but there's some rushing upside there for Ryan Tannehill, and this is not a very good Browns defense. We saw Mike Glennon actually have a halfway decent game in terms of fantasy points. He missed a lot of wide open guys, and he actually could have had a really big day, but Glennon's not the best quarterback in the world, and I would definitely say Ryan Tannehill is a lot better than Mike Glennon. But we're not going to have Denzel Ward in this game. Now, Myles Garrett should be back for this one, so that's obviously going to hurt the Titans' offensive line, and I guess it's going to apply more pressure to Ryan Tannehill. But without Denzel Ward, this is not a very good secondary at all, and they rank 23rd versus quarterbacks, and they're 23rd DVA versus the pass. So Tannehill, he should be able to have a pretty solid game here. I think you can play the entire Titans' offense. I'm not saying it's the best correlation play, but I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to be able to play Derrick Henry and Ryan Tannehill in the same lineup. It's not the best, but Tannehill is cheap enough to where it can work out. Because if the Titans do put up around 30 points, I would assume Tannehill probably threw 2 to 3 touchdowns, and Derrick Henry probably got into the end zone as well and probably hit over 100 rushing yards. So it can certainly work, although that might be better for tournaments than cash games. All right, and dropping down to one of my favorite quarterbacks to use for fantasy purposes, it's Ryan Fitzpatrick, and it's because he's always cheap. He has nothing to lose. He just goes out there, slings the rock to Devontae Parker and hopes it works out. He'll also run the ball a little bit as well, giving him a nice floor. So Fitzpatrick at $6,000 in a good matchup versus Cincinnati, I certainly have interest. The only problem is that they are 11-point favorites at home, so this game might not stay too competitive, and they might have to throw the ball much in the second half or the fourth quarter. But I still think he's going to be fine for his price point. I would not be surprised if he gets close to 300 yards, and he should throw 2 to 3 touchdowns. And he could get us 20, 30 yards on the ground, which is also nice as well. And there's also a little bit of upside for a rushing touchdown. Not saying it's expected, but there's certainly upside for that. But the Bengals are 26 DVA versus the pass. They're kind of mid-pack versus quarterbacks in terms of fantasy points given up per game. But I would not be surprised if he gets us 250 to 300 yards and 2 to 3 touchdowns, which at $6,000, that is definitely good enough for me. And then if you want to go all the way down, we have Derek Carr at $5,800. I know he was absolutely awful last week. The Raiders scored 3 points versus the Falcons, and the Falcons were giving up the most points per game to quarterbacks, over 300 passing yards per game, and Derek Carr just had, it was an absolute atrocity, whatever just happened. I think that's the right word for it. Either way, he was horrendous, terrible, whatever you want to call it. It was not a good NFL quarterback performance. But he gets another good matchup versus the Jets, and I feel like he has to bounce back at least a little bit. And with Josh Jacobs being banged up with the sprained ankle, they could rely on the passing game just a little bit more. And this is definitely a good matchup for it. The Jets are dead last, 32nd DVA versus the pass, and they're allowing the 4th most points per game to the position, close to 300 passing yards per game, and about 24 points per game as well. I know this is a team that likes to run the football, but he's cheap. It's a fantastic matchup. They have a team total of nearly 28 this week. I have a hard time seeing him have as bad a performance as he did last week, so hopefully he can bounce back a little bit. I do think he is a solid play. I feel like I lean towards Ryan Fitzpatrick just a little bit more, but both are fine, cheap plays. You just kind of have to get the bad taste out of your mouth from Derek Carr last week. I totally understand if you just want to pass up on that because that was a really, really bad game that he had. All right, moving on to the running back position, we have 2 absolute monsters up top in Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry, both above $9,000, and they're kind of in similar spots here. Both over-unders are pretty high here in the mid-50s. Well, I guess the Vikings are in the lower 50s or the mid-50s, but still. Both above 50. Both have team totals around 30. They're both home favorites, which always sets up well for the running back. They both get similar volume on the season. Really, the only thing separating them is that Dalvin Cook's just a little bit more involved in the passing game. His target share is double of Derrick Henry. So I guess that's where I'd have a slight lean to Dalvin Cook there. And he also gets the better matchup as well, as Jacksonville's allowing the 5th most points per game to running backs. Meanwhile, Cleveland's at the 11th fewest points per game. So should be a little bit easier for Dalvin Cook. Now, the only concerns I have with him is that he did get hurt in that last game versus the Carolina Panthers, was out for a series or two, ended up coming back in. But still, we're going to see if that swells up over the week. And if it does, that would make me want to lean more towards Derrick Henry. But if he's 100% good to go for only $300 more, I feel like Dalvin Cook might be the better play there. And I could see the ownership getting more so even here because they're similarly priced. Derrick Henry, he went off at lower ownership last week, and Dalvin Cook busted at high ownership. So I could see that ownership going from like this, and it could be kind of more like this week. So slightly Dalvin Cook in my opinion, but both are excellent plays. And then we'll move on to the mid-range where we have James Robinson and Austin Eckler. Both guys had some pretty darn good games last week, but James Robinson, he had an excellent game at only $6,300. His price came up $1,000, but it's another good matchup versus Minnesota. The problem is this is not a very good offense, and they're 9.5-point dogs on the road, so they might get to the point where they have to abandon the run, which can certainly cap James Robinson's upside. But he's the only guy that gets touches in that backfield, so you don't have to worry about another running back coming in there and stealing touches. He's involved in the passing game as well, had over a handful of targets last week. Now, the Vikings are kind of mid-pack versus running backs, but I'm not that concerned about it. They're allowing over 100 rushing yards per game. They're just not really giving up many rushing touchdowns. This is not a defense I'm scared of by any means. It's just the Jacksonville Jaguars offense is not that great, so that's kind of the only thing limiting him here, but he's been great all season long, super consistent, hasn't had a game below double-digit points. It's just with them being 9.5-point dogs, that's really the only concern there, but he should see around 20 touches, and I think he'll be fine. I just feel more as a GPP play because the price they come up $1,000. Austin Eckler, $7,100. Kalen Ballage was out last week, and Eckler was activated, and he was not limited in any way. He was on the field a ton, and he was really involved in the passing game, which is what I love from my running backs. Like, just look at his game log. I'll just read you his game log, actually, and what he did last week. He had 14 carries on the ground for only 44 yards, which, whatever, but he had 16 targets, 11 catches for 85 yards. He had pretty much 30 opportunities there, and it's a good matchup versus New England this week. They've been one of the worst defenses overall this year, and they're 28th DVA versus the run, kind of mid-pack versus running backs in terms of fantasy points given up per game, but I mean, Austin Eckler, if he's going to have usage like that once again, I can't expect him to get 16 targets each and every single week, but I assume we should see close to the double digits here, and he's going to get over double-digit touches on the ground. So at $7,100, I know the price came up quite a bit, but it almost feels like a steal if he's going to be that involved in the passing game. So Austin Eckler, he's kind of like Alvin Kamara. Then dropping down to some of the cheaper running backs, you have Chris Carson at $6,300. Now, we saw a little bit more Carlos Hyde than I expected, but you got to keep in mind that was Chris Carson's first game back, so they probably eased him in a little bit, and I feel like Chris Carson's going to take over that role in this game. And facing the Giants, I don't really have any concerns there. There are 9.5-point favorites at home, which does set up well for the home running back, although there's no implied team total yet or a over-under in this game, but I'd have to imagine the Seahawks are probably going to be close to 30 in this one versus the Giants. Not a very good team, and they're going to have Colt McCoy at quarterback, so I'm not expecting the Giants to put up much of a fight here, so this could definitely be a run-heavy approach for the Seattle Seahawks, and the Giants are the best run defense in the world. They're bottom half of the league in terms of fantasy points given up per game to the position, and close to 6 catches per game as well, and Chris Carson has been involved in the pass this season, about a 12% target share and a 19% weighted opportunity share, so I do think he's an interesting option, but I don't think he's a must-play by any means. Then getting into some of these cheaper running backs, we have Duke Johnson and David Montgomery. I have Duke Johnson here just because David Johnson is going to be out again, and they lost Will Fuller, so it's just going to be more targets redistributed through this offense. And I feel like for the most part, that'll be Brandon Cooks, Kiki Cutie, Jordan Akins, and Duke Johnson. So he's going to be involved in the passing game. He's on the field for almost all the snaps. Now, we saw CJ Prosise involved on Thanksgiving, and I know if you guys played Duke Johnson, you probably hated seeing that CJ Prosise touchdown, which I did too. But for the most part, it's the Duke Johnson show here, and I know the price is coming up close to $6,000 now, but I still feel like he's fine just from a volume standpoint, but the matchup versus Indy is obviously not the greatest in the world, but we still have a 51.5-point over in this game, so there's still points expected to be scored. I just don't think it's going to be an absolute shootout, especially with Will Fuller being gone. And then David Montgomery at $5,500. Unfortunately, it looks like it might be David Montgomery chalk week, and I say that because he's a hard guy to trust, but it's a great matchup versus Detroit, and he actually had a good game versus the Green Bay Packers, had close to 30 Draftkings points. The guy actually looked pretty decent in that game, ripped off a long run, and you can't ask for a much better matchup than Detroit. They are one of the worst run defenses in football, 23rd DVA versus the run, but they are allowing the most points bringing into the position at 33.8 points per game, over 115 rushing yards per game, and over a rushing touchdown per game as well. And Montgomery in that backfield, he's pretty much the only guy that's going to get touches, so $5,500. He's a fine flex running back this week, or if you just want to go 2 running backs, you can sign him at the RB2 position as well. But the volume's going to be there, should get close to 20 touches, and they're 3-point favorites at home. So I think he's a fine option, but Dave Montgomery chalk never feels that great. I'll say that. And moving on to the wide receiver position up top, we have Davante Adams at a super expensive price tag of $9,000, but he's been one of the safest rosters all season long. Matchup versus Philly, it's pretty solid. We saw DK Metcalf go for nearly 200 yards last night. They left him one-on-one with Darius Slay, which was obviously a mistake. If they do that again with Davante Adams, it's going to be another field day for him. But even if they don't, Davante Adams usually has a good game each and every single week. I would go further into this, but you guys get the idea. Adams is an elite play each and every single week. The problem with him is that at $9,000, he's probably going to cost you a Dalvin Cook or Derrick Henry. And personally, I like spending up for running backs rather than wide receivers because it's pretty hard to find a good, cheap running back that's going to see volume. Meanwhile, we can get cheap wide receivers every single week that they're going to see targets. So I kind of always lean towards running backs over wide receivers. But if you got the money for them, obviously a fantastic play. I'd show you guys the numbers, but you guys get the idea. Double-digit targets per game, one of the best wide receivers in football, one of the best quarterbacks throwing the ball. Yeah, he's a good play. He's just really expensive. Allen Robinson, another elite talented wide receiver, but unfortunately, unlike Davante Adams, he's got one of the worst quarterbacks throwing the football, and that's been a theme of his career. I would love to see Allen Robinson with a good quarterback because the guy would just be... The thing is, he already puts up really good numbers, but he would be so good if he had a guy like Aaron Rodgers throwing the football. Unfortunately, he's had Blake Bortles, Nick Foles, Mitch Trubisky. Not a fun time there for Allen Robinson, but he's cheap enough to where I have interested here versus Detroit. The volume's there each and every single week. He's one of the best wide receivers in football, but... Man, Mitch Trubisky, not a good quarterback at all, and it sounds like he's going to start once again. But the Lions are 28th DV versus the pass, and they're allowing the 24th most points per game to wide receivers, so it's a pretty good spot for Robinson. I do have interest in him. Devontae Parker, the price they come up about $500, but as long as Ryan Fitzpatrick's the quarterback, I'm going to be on Devontae Parker every single time unless he gets above $7,000. But it's a good matchup versus Cincy. He had almost 15 targets last week, or he might have had 15 targets. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was pretty close to it. Had a good game, over 100 yards. Unfortunately, did not get into the end zone, but... Oh, and if you're wondering why the wide receiver versus cornerback matchup advantage column is blank, that's because the week is not technically ended yet, but I'm sure that'll update by Wednesday or Thursday if the Ravens and the Steelers game is played. But I forget where I was going with that. But Devontae Parker, he's fine, but probably more of a tournament play at that price point, but it's a good matchup versus Cincy. Robert Woods, he's still cheaper than Cooper Kupp, and I feel like they're the same play each and every single week, so I'm always going to side with Robert Woods, below $6,000, and he's a very safe play. Now, Cooper Kupp did not have a good game last week, but Robert Woods still was fine versus the 49ers, over 7 targets per game, over a 21% target share. I just think he's a safe volume play. We know he's going to get the work every single week, and he always has touchdown upside as well. Only a 7.1 ADOT, he's more of a possession wide receiver, but... Only $1,500 in a good matchup versus the Cardinals. I definitely have some interest in Robert Woods. They're 22nd versus wide receivers this season. So I definitely like him at that price point. Brandon Cooks at $5,600. I imagine he's going to be pretty popular this week. We have a 51.5 point over-under in this game. And with Will Fuller being out, that's a guy with around a 20% target share and about 7-8 targets per game. So if you take him out of the equation, yeah, you got to redistribute some targets in this offense. And Brandon Cooks is now the wide receiver 1. And we know the guy's a talented wide receiver. He's just been kind of second fiddle to Will Fuller. But, I mean, Watson's going to probably put up close to 300 yards in this one. It's got to go somewhere. So I assume Brandon Cooks should have a pretty solid game here. And I know the matchup versus the Colts, they haven't really been giving up too many points per game to the wide receivers. They're actually on the 7th fewest points per game. They're 60 versus the pass. But he's got a great quarterback throwing the football, and they got to move the ball somehow. So Brandon Cooks, I mean, he should be in line for a pretty good game here at only $5,600. Corey Davis at $5,100. I was going to put A.J. Brown here, but he's pretty expensive. So I went with Corey Davis here just because he's cheaper, and he still sees close to 7 targets per game, a 23.6% target share, and an 8 out of 11. So if you want exposure to the passing game here, I just like the cheaper option a little bit better. I don't think he's as good as A.J. Brown, but still, he's a talented wide receiver. We have a 30-point applied team total here, 54 point over under, and only a 5.5 point spread. So this could be a shootout. And the Browns secondary without Denzel Ward is nothing to be too concerned about. So Corey Davis should have a pretty solid game at the price. Hunter Renfrow at $4,300. This is a great matchup versus the Jets. He had over double-digit targets in the last game. He's not someone that's going to put up huge games because he's kind of a low ADOT guy, only 8.9 average depth of target, but I still think he's a fine play because he's cheap, and the Jets secondary is absolutely trash. Dead last, 32nd DV versus the pass, and allowing the 5th most points per game to the position. Kiki Cutie, this is just because Will Fuller is going to be out, so he's going to be a guy that's going to get a bump in targets, and he's only $3,500, so I think he's fine for that price. Then Chris Conley, he missed the last game. If he happens to be back, though, he is the bare minimum $3,000. In a per-game basis this season, about a handful of targets, a 12.8% target share, and an 8 up 10.4, and a 52-point over-under in this game, and they're 9.5-point dogs on the road, so I would expect them to be throwing the ball quite a bit in this game. I know Mike Glenn is not the best quarterback in the world, but if he can get us 5 some targets, if he's good to go in this one at $3,000, that can really open up your lineup. And maybe if you go with him and use a cheaper quarterback, you could make a Devontae Adams and like a Derrick Henry or a Dalvin Cook lineup. So he's just kind of there just to completely open up your lineup at the bare minimum price tag, but we do not know if he's going to be playing as of right now, so that could obviously change. With that being said, we can move on to the tight ends now. I feel like this video has been very long, so we're in the final stretch here, so if you're still watching, bear with me. We'll kind of get to the tight end position a little bit quicker because there's not really too much to talk about with tight ends. But Darren Waller, I feel like he's easily the best tight end play on the slate, but man, he really busted last week. He did nothing. It took Nathan Peterman to get him a couple of targets in the end of the game to get above like 2 or 3 points. But it's a good matchup versus the Jets, one of the worst secondaries in football. They have a team total of nearly 28 this week, and close to 8 targets per game, 57% weight opportunity share, the highest target share of any tight end in the league. So, yeah, he's a fine option. It's just, he is expensive, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to spend it for a tight end this week, but if you got the money for him, he should bounce back. Hunter Henry saw double-digit targets last week, and he's not the most exciting play in the world, only an 8 out of 8, although it's slightly higher than Darren Waller. He's got a really good quarterback throwing the football, but you're probably never excited to play Hunter Henry unless he gets into the end zone, but there's always upside for that, and they are 30th DVA versus the pass, New England is, so I think he's a fine option, but nothing exciting. Austin Hooper, the targets have been way down for him, but he is always a touchdown threat, so I think he's fine there. It's a 54-point over-under in this game and a 5.5-point spread, so there's always touchdown upside for him, but he's really not been getting the job done in the yardage department. Robert Tonyan at $3,700. He's had 2 good games back-to-back, so I think he's fine. If you want to use Aaron Rodgers, he's a fine pairing with him. And I feel like he's a bit too cheap here. So he could be a good way to get cheap exposure to the passing game for the Green Bay Packers if you don't play Devontae Adams. Trey Burton at $3,500, the tight end one in that offense. It's a good matchup versus Houston. And Vegas thinks a lot of points are going to be scored in this game, and Houston certainly does not have that good of a defense, so I do think Burton's is viable at $3,500. Should see a handful of targets. The Texans haven't exactly been awful versus tight ends, more so mid-pack, but close to 60 receiving yards per game. And he's been scoring some touchdowns this year, so I think he's fine in that regard. Then Jordan Akins at $2,900. I'm sure he killed a lot of your guys' hopes and dreams on Thanksgiving, but the opportunity was there, but he dropped 2 touchdowns. He had 2 targets in that game. Both were in the end zone, and he dropped both of them. He could have had a really good game at only, I think he was $2,900 in that game, same as he is in this one, but sometimes you just get a little bit unlucky. Hopefully the butter is off his fingers. He's able to catch the ball in this one. But with Will Fuller being out, there should be at least an uptick in usage to his targets, so I think Jordan Akins is fine at that cheap price point, just getting exposure to that Houston Texans passing game that's missing a key cog to their lineup. And if you're looking at how the Colts have been versus the past this year, 6 DVOA and allowing the 3rd fewest points per game to the position, but this is mainly just a price play with one of the main pieces of their offense out. They'll move on to the defense, which is never something I really like talking about. I mainly just try to pick favorites here, or if they're cheap, try to face face offenses that aren't that great. But the Dolphins, 11-point favorites at home versus Cincy, who have Brandon Allen at quarterback with a 15.5 implied team total, so not really concerned there. The Packers are facing the Carson Wentz-led Eagles, and we've seen Carson Wentz play football this year, so I think that makes sense. They're also at home. The Vikings, they're playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're 9.5-point favorites at home. The Seahawks, there's no implied team total yet for the Giants, but they're going to be facing Colt McCoy, which, look, I'm a Browns fan, so I always have a soft spot in my heart for Colt McCoy, especially after you beat the Patriots back in, I forget what year that was. I was still a young child, but I'm always going to love him after that game, but he's not that good of a quarterback. The Lions are facing Mitch Trubisky. I feel like that's self-explanatory. And the Jets, awful defense, but they're playing Derek Carr, who's certainly not the best quarterback in the world, but they're only $2,100, and they've actually been somewhat okay fantasy points-wise relative to their price tag, so I don't think they're the worst defense in the world to use at only $2,100, especially if Josh Jacobs happens to miss this game. And with that being said, guys, that's going to be it for this video, so I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. If you want to support the channel over on Patreon, like I said, links down below for that. It's $10 a month. You get access into the entire spreadsheet. And yeah, that's going to be it. Leave a like, Subscribe if you're new. Follow me over on social media if you want. And I'll see you guys in the next one.